All right, let's answer this question.
Knock it out. Let's do it, dude. I really like answering
Hey,
questions.
crew.
Sorry.
Chris Luke here, long-time listener, second-time caller. I got a bit of a technical spinal health movement question for you guys. I know you've had Stu McGill on the podcast, and you guys are big fans of Stu's. He's a real smart guy. He, at least from what I understand, and maybe I misunderstand him, he talks a lot about having a very rigid spine. Keeping a rigid spine, moving at the hips, moving at the shoulders. My question is, you also hear claims from different people like Chris Summers or the knees over toes guy talking about Jefferson curls and allowing the spine to round forward. Then we also see exercises like the teapot in a lot of the power athlete programs where we're rounding the spine laterally. I guess my question is, how do you, justify the spine rounding versus not rounding the spine? Anyways, that's my question. If you guys could elaborate on that, I think that'd be pretty cool. Thanks, and bye.
Two things. I never trust a man that has two first names. For Chris Luke, I don't know.
It's my virtual training client, John.
And then the other piece is when somebody uses the words, how do you justify? When I hear that, I'm like, I don't have to justify anything to you, but I will talk about, the difference. I mean, the Jefferson curl is extremely controversial type movement. Yes, Stu McGill likes a rigid spine.
So let's get into it. For those unfamiliar with a Jefferson curl, can we talk setup and execution?
Go for it.
Awesome. Imagine now I'm going to stand up on a box. I'm going to stand on the very corner, so both of my toes, the point of that box is in between my toes because I need more range of motion for the dumbbells to pass my feet. What I want to do then is stand tall. I have a dumbbell in each hand for this variation of it. Tall.
I've seen it done with barbells.
Right. Just how I would describe it or how I would imagine us programming it within the power athlete realm would be dumbbells. But why? Because I want my shoulder action in there. I'm going to start with my shoulders externally rotated. So imagine my thumbs pointing out to the sides here. Tall, pretty posture, dumbbell on each side. I'm going to initiate my spine action with my neck, my head. So I'm going to tuck my chin to begin. And as I'm aiming to curl one vertebrae at a time, my shoulders will internally rotate, and I begin to protract away from my spine as my spine is reaching down, aiming to have these dumbbells travel in a straight line, going down from my hips to my legs and eventually past my feet. And I'm almost bent over with a curled spine, keeping my chin tucked. The curl now, as I'm going to curl up, I'm going to have hips in a neutral position, aiming to only move my spine, reversing this action, stacking my vertebrae one at a time, returning to tall, pretty posture, and then externally rotating at the top, returning to a good formal shoulder and spine position. We can do that with weight. We can do it without weight. Maintain a slight bend in the knee, and the objective is to have your whole posterior chain pulling through, so you're tapping into, yes, your calves, to your hamstrings, to your glutes, all the way through up your spinal erectors. So not just the back here, it's that whole posterior chain backside. In this, how I would coach up the Jefferson curl, we see people F it up by straight knees. We see people F it up by lifting their chin and looking up as they're going down. I'll think of a few other faults that we see within that, but just how it's been coached to me, and then I've coached through to athletes.
What do you think the benefit of it is?
Stability. So actually returning your spine to good posture. I like to apply it to athletes. Imagine the infinite imperfections that happen within sport, where we say, all right, rigid spine like Stu McGill with our athletes, but then you've played in the complete chaos that is a field court sport. we have to then maintain or return to a good spine position. This is a controlled way for us to do that through the sagittal plane.
So when you're doing the Jefferson curl, what are you using, like 600 pounds?
I would probably any range, which you can control the action, nice and steady controlled. It could be 10 pounds or it could be up to 100 pounds if you're able to control it.
It's a lighter weight that's a mobility, kind of a stretching with weight, almost like a mobility exercise to teach greater connection with the spine going through the different rounding positions and helping to get back into a more stable neutral position.
Through your range of motion.
Okay.
As an individual.
So we're not programming like 600-pound Jefferson curls, and we're also not putting the bar on the back asking somebody to do that cervically loading their spine with 500 pounds and doing a Jefferson curl.
Cervically loading, John, that's a good point. No, we would not ask them to do that.
Okay. So the fact that our listener or our question person is confused with the fact of like a kind of a strength mobility thing that's really, used by, like you said, Chris Summers, and for high level gymnasts who base their entire training on basically stability and isometric contraction, smaller dudes, task specific tension, very dynamic in nature, and also very, very high level athletes opposed from people who are going into the gym and putting a heavy bar on their back, where the one place you don't want to have a ton of spinal movement and you want to have a nice rigid spine. The way Stu McGill describes the spine is there's, discs and tendons and, everything around it are like steel belts. And that if you can create a good rigid spine, you can transfer force under load, like with a deadlift and with a heavy squat. Now, what people forget all too often is that if you want to lift heavy weights and survive them, you have to have an extremely rigid spine. So while people like Chris Summers are training gymnasts, which is dynamic in another way, those guys are not going in and banging heavy weights every single day. It's not like, hey, I'm a high-level Olympic gymnast and I just set the world powerlifting record. So I think that there's kind of a confusion where, what are you trying to do? And more importantly, are you trying to get out the other side of this thing without a severe injury? Stu McGill, who is, I learned of Stu McGill years ago when I was in the NFL. He was kind of the Indiana Jones of back pain. You'd hear like whispers like, oh, he hurt his back, he's going to go see Stu McGill. And I just thought that Stu McGill was kind of this legendary dude that just was magically the back pain detective. And it wasn't until I retired, because I never had any back pain. So I was very focused on not only a rigid spine, but I looked at two injury mechanisms, and both of which Stu McGill co-signed when we were on our podcast years ago. I saw guys, when they were overextended, all of a sudden get loaded, and from this overextended position, they would get hit or they couldn't maintain spine stability, and it came from what I thought was a weak trunk. Weak abs. That's why we do a ton of dead bugs. The other one was rotation,
right?
Transverse plane and then a load. So guys would be setting one way, they'd be turning, and then they would get loaded unexpectedly, and that would hurt their back. So that's why you see in all the programs a lot of dynamic med ball work, which is transverse plane, rotation, throw, task-specific tension, catch. And I did a ton of that rotational med ball work in all of my NFL career, still do a ton, because that is what has allowed me to not have back injuries.
And if we look at getting to the power athlete training here, when we're working with the spine and a lot of our accessory work, so dynamic med ball work, I'm going to talk about that right after this. First, we want to increase our range of motion and stability within said range of motion. We accomplish that by locking the hips in place and then rotating or bending laterally to the left and the right. Example Chris talked about on his call was the teapot. Let's say we step into a lunge position. I could teapot from my lunge, but my hips are locked in my primal lunge.
Yeah, I don't really think that the back is bending. I mean, like, when we set up and we do a lateral, I mean, it's more like a short kind of movement. It's not like we're doing a lateral Jefferson curl.
Correct. It would be more upper torso and aim to increase our what's the top spine? I'm blanking here. The rib cage spine, would not our lumbar or thoracic spine.
Yeah, thoracic
aim
spine
is to increase thoracic mobility, because in that lateral flexion extension, we can breathe into one lung and aim to open that up. But either way, if we program it, I'm going to lock into a lunge, or I'm going to lock into an X, say my feet are neutral position, or even a step up. And that's one of the hardest things, where I step up. Imagine I'm holding a high knee position and hitting my, not Captain Morgan's, my teapots to the left and the right. And then we have lunge position rotations.
I stole all those teapots from Ruiz.
Oh yeah,
but we did a ton of that banded rotation, and we did a ton of that, especially with being able to come back and then bring it here. But it was more about stretching and strengthening the obliques, because we all of a sudden saw a rash of dudes in the NFL that started tearing their obliques, and we thought it was from like weak hip flexors. Now, I mean, based upon what we know years later, it probably comes from a weakness in the collapsing of the arch.
Yep.
Knee comes in, guys are compensating, and all of a sudden now we have an up chain effect, and then the rotation of tearing the oblique.
So when we set up in that position where there's the lunge or the step up, we can coach them at the feet, but the hips, the aim is to lock them into a primal position, and then spine moves opposite the hips. When now, say we are heavy lifting primal, John, and cervically loading, our spine is rigid, but now our hips are moving in the action.
Well, like the secret of a healthy spine, and I know this is like, what do you want to do, right? Like,
that's a great question.
You know, I mean, it's pretty interesting. Like, what are you trying to do? And there's, you know, this kind of schizophrenic mindset within, you know, much of training where, you know, and that's, I think, why CrossFit was so big, because, you know, it allowed people mediocrity in everything, right? Like you can be, you know, we can do your stuff better than you, but you can't do ours. You know, there was this whole fucking Glassmanian craziness, but like the idea of like constantly varied, learn new sports. I mean, some of the original stuff from that was genius, but people became just super gym centric. And when you're just doing the same movement over and over, that looks like bilateral hip hinging and just some form of sagittal plane sagittal plane. You know, all of a sudden that reduces athleticism, and those original observations of dealing with the CrossFit market was led to Field Strong, because when Glassman asked me, do you think CrossFit is an athletic style of training? I said, no, it's not. And he was taken back, like, how dare I assault the crown? And I was like, well, what have you done athletically? You're, you know, I mean, you were struck down at a young age with polio. You were, you know, a ring, you know, upper body based gymnast. You never played any sports, no change of direction. Your entire program's based on hinging and sagittal plane straight ahead, other than virtual shoveling. And with that in mind, you know, what I understand about athleticism and the blueprint for athleticism, primal movement patterns, the ability to step, squat, and lunge and move through space, like that's what I know athleticism is, the ability to seamlessly and effortlessly combine primal movement patterns through space to accomplish a known or novel task. Boom, print it. The definition of athleticism in power athlete land. The training has to be representative. Now, if we're going to use weights, and especially step, squat, and lunge, X, Y, and Z axis, and we're going to load them, you're going to need a rigid spine to transfer force between the bar, your upper body, and your lower body. And if you have a fucking spine of jello that's not rigid, you're going to have a ton of back pain, you're going to be hurt, and you're going to be fucking miserable for the rest of your life. Or you can work on a ton of stability. That's why we don't do flexion and extension when we do some form of trunk work. Everything is moving the limbs independent, isometric contractions. Can I maintain stability? Because stability comes from isometric contractions. So just watching people do flexion and extension, like when we worked with the U.S. Army, and when I'm looking at their PT test, and I'm wondering why they have, you know, tens of thousands of people on profile, because they have back injuries from doing nothing but overloading flexion and extension in a fucking seat, in a sit-up.
And then sitting down.
And then sitting down all day. You know, it's one of those things where you're talking to the surgeon, and he's explaining like the profiles and the injuries. And I'm like, so wait a minute, everybody has back injuries? Okay. What are they doing? Oh, these guys are fucking doing sit-ups like, you know, like rabbits, you know, trying to hop out of a cage, because that's what's required to get advancement in their jobs. So they're going to be the best flexion and extensioner that you've ever seen. And then they wonder why people are hurt. Like, it's like, I felt like I was taking crazy pills.
Well, you weren't, John.
No, I wasn't taking crazy pills. But I think if the goal is to lift heavy weights for a lifetime, and you've heard me say it, that I think that people don't stop lifting weights because they get old. I think they get old because they stop lifting weights. And they stop being strong, and they start fostering a culture, like physical culture of athleticism and strength. And they're not fighting, you know, trying to kick old man Father Time every day in the balls. But I think you have to understand what you're trying to do. Are you trying to be a high-level gymnast? If you want to incorporate some stuff like some Jefferson curls, Texas got a really good reasoning for it. If your goal is to be able to transfer force and bang heavy weights for a lifetime, you want a nice rigid spine.
Yeah. And, I mean, I'm not afraid to mix that into some field strong stuff, but you'll see it towards the end of the training.
And not 600 pounds.
And not 600 pounds. And also, I mean, let's do unilateral. Let's turn this sagittal plane into a multi-plane movement. How we would do that with the Jefferson curl is a single dumbbell in one hand, and then we're fighting against this rotation to maintain posture and movement through the sagittal plane, which turns sagittal plane into a multi-plane training.
Well, if you're going to play sports, you're going to be on one leg.
Well,
and there is a dramatic need for unilateral movements. Mm-hmm. But we have to balance that because we know that we can load bilateral movements heavier than we can single leg movements. Years ago, wasn't that long ago. Who do we have on our buddy who hated the back squat?
Dr. Mike Martino.
No, Boyle. Mike
Boyle.
Yeah, remember Mike Boyle, the death of the back squat? He was working with a lot of high-level hockey guys, and he found that there was less pain associated with doing single leg movements. So instead of basically putting these guys into torture and forcing them to do bilateral movements that put them into bad positions, he just had them do unilateral movements. Now, if he had been a little more creative with bars and setups and maybe, some box squats or different things, I think there's ways to mitigate all that stuff. But he didn't have time for that. I ain't got time for that bullshit. Let me just figure out how I can get the most amount of work done. And he found using unilateral movements were better for these individuals.
Oh, yeah.
But also hockey guys are on one leg a lot. So it makes sense.
The time of year, if he was working majority of in-season training with these guys, they got, 70 some odd games, including playoffs. I'm not a hockey guy, I don't know. But that on top of the training that he was contracted to do, he had to find ways to still instill proper movement on top of the intensity of a game. And those guys are traveling and going hard.
Yep.
Outside of games.
No, it's I think it comes down to what are you training for, who are you, and what do you want to do?
I'm going back, I'm a loaded freight train, and I'm right on track.